Hey, hi, hello. Welcome to Diana Emerson today. We will be listening to quite a few cold cases that has been finally solved in 2022.
I'm not involved. I'll tell you that. I'm not involved. Well, why should somebody put you there? I don't know. I've been telling you all along. I don't say. I'm saying I don't know. I don't know what they put me in there for.
For days, police searched for Lynette White, a witness for the prosecution in two separate trials. They assumed she was just laying low. That was until they made a forced entry into her apartment. And there she was, not laying low, but lying dead. What happened to Lynette White? Welcome back to Mysterious 7, where we shed light on under the radar cases from across the globe. Without further ado, let's get into it. Lynette White was a beautiful young woman from Cardiff, Wales, who was doing what she believed she had to do in order to get by. She dropped out of school and had been working as a prostitute since she was 14. Being a sex worker wasn't part of Lynette's childhood dream. Weeks before she was found dead, Tim Rogers, a BBC Wales journalist, interviewed her while investigating child prostitution. During the interview, she told Tim how she was drugged, taken to Bristol by a gang of men, and forced into prostitution. Yet even after Lynette found her way back to Cardiff, she could not find her way out of prostitution. By 1988, Lynette, who was now 20 years old, was working the streets daily as a prostitute. Described as popular and pretty by friends, Lynette was probably the most visible prostitute working in Cardiff at the time. She was the first girl to be out at lunchtime and would be the last to leave at night. Working every day, rain or shine, even on Christmas, earning £100 per night. One would almost think White was working hard to have a better life. But that was not the case. It was all to pay for her boyfriend, Stephen Miller's cocaine addiction. Every night, Miller took 60 to 90 pounds from Lynette, who was his only source of income. Lynette lived with Miller in a flat on Dorset Street in Cardiff. Each day, Miller would drive her to Riverside in Cardiff, where she worked, and meet her later in the evening at the North Star Club to collect her earnings. It continued like that every day until February 9th, 1988 was the last day Miller saw Lynette. She had not made contact with Miller or her friends in the days leading up to her death, which was very odd behavior for her. She was also due to make an appearance as a witness for two prosecution trials when she disappeared. No one knows the reason why White stopped contacting others 5 days prior to her death. The police thought she was deliberately hiding to avoid giving evidence and began to actively search for her. Earlier that same month, Leanne Vilday, Lynette's friend, had loaned Lynette her keys to a flat for the purpose of taking clients there for sex. On February 14th, 1988, in the evening, Leanne, who probably wanted to use the flat, went there but found it locked, which was quite unusual. Lynette was nowhere to be found. Leanne became very worried about Lynette. She drove to Butetown Police Station to report her friend's disappearance. She returned to her James Street flat with three policemen who were expecting to serve an arrest warrant on Lynette and take her in. The policemen forced entry into the apartment and found Lynette lying there, in a pool of her own blood. A missing witness found dead with massive injuries. Who murdered Lynette White? According to the autopsy performed by pathologist Bernard Knight, Lynette had been stabbed over 50 times on her chest, face, stomach, wrist, breasts, arms, hands, and inner thighs. Her throat was also savagely slit from ear to ear. Though she was stabbed multiple times, the autopsy revealed that Lynette died from the throat injury. The pathologist also determined that Lynette was murdered on February 14th between 1:45 a.m. and 4 o'clock a.m. Lynette's body was found between the foot of the bed and the window, covered in blood. Azoospermic semen, which is semen containing no sperm, was found in her vagina and also on her underwear. There were 2 different blood types found on Lynette, her own blood and an AB type blood, which did not belong to Lynette. Soon the news about Lynette's death had spread, and police began to ask questions about the incident. Witnesses told the police that they saw a man looking distressed in the area where Lynette's body was found on James Street. The man looked very suspicious, and he appeared to have blood on his hands. The suspicious man, described as a white male, approximately 5'8" to 5'10", and in his mid-30s, became the primary focus of the investigation. Efforts to find this man were exhaustive. Soon they arrested a man that matched the suspect's description, but he was soon released after he presented his alibi. Police looked into Miller, Lynette's boyfriend, as the partner of a murder victim is usually the first obvious suspect. Miller was questioned but later released because his blood type didn't match the one found on Lynette. Because Lynette was supposed to appear as a witness against a man named Francine Cordell in court, Francine and his mother were investigated, but soon the 2 were eliminated as suspects because their blood also did not match the AB blood type found on Lynette. Very little is known about the case against Cordell or the other case that Lynette was set to give evidence in. Another suspect that piqued the investigators' interest was a man who was on a list of 12 persons of interest in the area due to their past criminal activity. He was a sex offender and a pedophile who lived close to James Street. His identity was concealed, and he was called Mr. X. When Mr. X was interviewed, he admitted to paying Lynette for sex in the past and was unable to account for his whereabouts at the time of the murder. Mr. X had blood type AB, which prompted the police to run a DNA test on him. When the results came back, it eliminated Mr. X from the investigation. Now, all that the police were left with were statements gathered from their door-to-door inquiry. Gromick, who lived in the flat right above where Lynette was murdered, together with his friend Atkins, gave statements implicating each other in their accounts. But as the statements contained 4 completely different accounts, the investigators didn't take it seriously. Ronnie Williams, a police informant, also gave an account implicating his common-law brother-in-law, Yusuf Abdullahi. He initially claimed Abdullahi knew the killer and later implicated him directly, saying Abdullahi was the killer. It was known to the police that the 2 detested each other, so again, investigators dismissed the account. Leanne Vilday, who reported Lynette's disappearance on the day she died, was also suspected and questioned. The police visited her daily to question her. The pressure was becoming too much for her to handle, and one day, while she was drunk, she named Miller and Abdullahi as the killers. Violet Perriam, a secretary at a Cardiff yacht club, also gave a statement about the incident. 8 months into the investigation, she came forward claiming that on February 14th, while driving home from the club at about 1:30 a.m., she saw 4 excited black males outside the building where Lynette was killed. She then identified 2 of them as John Actie and Rashid Omar. Perriam's statement would give the case a new direction. Angela Sala, who is mildly mentally retarded, also gave a statement that she saw Miller, John, Rashid, Ronnie Acton, John's cousin, Tony Paris, and Tony Brace outside 7 James Street on the day Lynette was murdered. This was exactly what police needed, as her account corroborated Perriam's statement. Further implicating Abdullahi, John, Miller, and the rest were Gromick and Atkins, who gave new statements on the same day with Sala. They said they also saw a group of men, including Ronnie and Abdullahi. Sala then gave another statement in December 1988 that she heard a scream from Lynette's flat and rushed there with Vilday. Coincidentally, on the same day, Vilday also told the police that she went to the flat after she heard Lynette scream and met Miller, Abdullahi, Ronnie Actie, Miller's brother, and an unnamed mixed-race man. Unfortunately for Sala, she had an AB blood type. Police insisted that her blood was found on Lynette's socks. She then gave a new statement that she was part of the killing together with Vilday and the other guys. Vilde also admitted that she was forced to cut Lynette's wrist to ensure her complicity in silence. Miller confessed to killing Lynette after 307 denials. He also implicated the other men named, which led to the arrest of all the men allegedly involved in the murder. On December 7, 1988, the police arrested Stephen and Tony Miller, Youssef Abdullahi, Ronnie Akhti, Rashid Omar, and Martin Tucker. On December 9, 1988, John Akhti and Tony Paris were also arrested. For close to a year, they were locked up until their trial began on October 5, 1989, at Swansea Crown Court. This trial became the longest murder trial in British legal history, lasting 197 days. After spending 2 years in custody, Ronnie and John Akhti were acquitted of the murder, while Tony Paris, Stephen Miller, and Youssef Abdullahi were found guilty. Each were sentenced to life imprisonment, and since then they're known as the Cardiff Three. Even though no forensic evidence linked these men to the crime scene, they were held as the criminals. However, there were a lot of doubts and questions about the convictions. Consequently, the friends and families of the Cardiff Three began a campaign to overturn the convictions. The campaign received massive support and was followed by television documentaries in 1992. By December 1992, the Cardiff Three's appeal was heard. After the Court of Appeal had listened to Miller's interrogation, Lord Taylor said the police had bullied Miller during the interview.
Get involved, you must times the two. I'm not involved. I'll tell you that. I'm not involved. Well, why should somebody put you there? I don't know. I've been telling you all along. I don't know. I don't know what they put me in there for.
Therefore, the truthfulness of Miller's admission was irrelevant. The Cardiff Three were free at last. Their convictions were declared unsafe and unsatisfactory by Lord Taylor. But if the Cardiff Three didn't commit the crime, it means the real criminal was still roaming free. It brings us to yet the same question. Who murdered Lynette White? 8 years later, the case was reopened. This time, Professor Dave Barclay and Chief Superintendent Kevin O'Neill were assigned to the task. The case took the officers back to the crime scene. By then, it was already 12 years since the incident happened. While examining the old crime scene photographs, Professor Barclay's eyes caught something that no one else saw in all these years. It was a large drop of blood, believed to have been thrown from a knife onto the wallpaper. When the crime was committed in 1988, police removed lots of wallpaper in the flat to be stored as evidence. Upon searching through the old wallpaper evidence, they discovered that the only missing piece of wallpaper was the one that contained the large drop of blood. The forensic scientist didn't give up, though. He continued to study the crime scene photos and realized the blood could have dropped on the skirting board beneath. Underneath several layers of paint, the team found the blood completely sealed in and dry. Traces of the blood were also found on a piece of cellophane wrapper from a cigarette pack. Since then, the detectives and scientists dubbed the suspect Cellophane Man. The forensics team, led by Angela Gallup, got to work, but shockingly, the DNA profile was not found in any of the 140 police databases. But when the police searched for similar profiles, it was narrowed to just hundreds in the Cardiff area. Using the approach of familial DNA searching, a partial match was eventually made with the profile of a 14-year-old boy. This boy was known to the police as he was once arrested for joyriding in Cardiff. But could he be the Cellophane Man? If you thought about his age, then your guess was right. He wasn't even born when the incident happened. At that time, the case was 15 years old. Notwithstanding, the police had to visit his house. When they got there, they were told that the boy's father was dead, but he had an uncle, Jeffrey Gafour. On February 26, 2003, detectives pulled up at Jeffrey's home, a semi-detached house in the village of Llanharan, 15 miles west of Cardiff, but no one was home. The following day, they checked at Jeffrey's place of work, an office block in Cardiff city centre where he worked as the security guard. When the police explained the reason for their visit, Jeffrey said, "Oh, I thought you got some guys for that." He was asked to provide a mouth swab, and he complied. Immediately, police checked the swab. They had finally caught the cellophane man. Chief Superintendent Kevin O'Neill was determined to do things right this time. He put a surveillance team on Jeffrey while he made preparations for the interview. Chief O'Neill had plans to put surveillance on Jeffrey for a whole week, but on February 28, 2003, Jeffrey made a crazy move. The surveillance team spotted him at a garage where he bought 3 packets of paracetamol, an over-the-counter pain reliever. By the time the police got to Jeffrey's house, he had taken about 62 paracetamols. Jeffrey denied ever taking those tablets, but he announced, "Just for the record, I did kill Lynette White. I've been waiting for this for 15 years. Whatever happens, I deserve it. I sincerely hope to die." He was taken to the hospital where he told a staff member that he was being watched because of a murder he committed 15 years ago. Jeffrey was prepared to die, as he initially refused to be treated. He eventually agreed to take an antidote. Within a few days, he had recovered. On July 4, 2003, Jeffrey pleaded guilty to Lynette White's murder, and the judge, Justice Royce, sentenced him to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 12 years and 8 months. Jeffrey's barrister said Jeffrey killed Lynette over 30 pounds for sex. He said Jeffrey wanted his money back when he changed his mind. In February 2007, Atkins, Sela, Vilde, and Gromek were charged with perjury. By December 2008, Sela, Vilde, and Gromek were found guilty and sentenced to 18 months of imprisonment each. Atkins was exempted because it was believed that he was bullied, threatened, abused, and manipulated to admit to false accounts suggested to him. In March 2009, it was announced that there was enough evidence to prosecute the police officers involved in the initial investigation with conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. In 2011, the trial collapsed due to missing evidence. In 2015, 8 of the 15 charged officers cleared of perverting the course of justice launched a high court civil action against the force, suing for malicious prosecution, false imprisonment, and misfeasance. But at the end of 2015, the judge in the civil action dismissed their case. The 5 falsely accused men were compensated after their release. Stephen Miller was paid £571,000. John Actie was paid £300,000, while Tony Paris was paid £250,000. Ron Actie died in 2007 after much struggle to cope with what had happened to him. Yusuf Abdullahi also died in 2011 of perforated cancer. He too had battled with post-traumatic stress disorder. On December 10, 1976, 81-year-old World War I veteran George Clarence Seitz left his house to get a nice haircut in a nearby barbershop in Jamaica, Queens. The old man mysteriously vanished into thin air, leaving behind no clues. Where did he go after leaving the house? What could have happened to him after setting out to do a harmless daily chore? The answer to these questions would remain a mystery for 4 decades. Today's story takes us to Jamaica, a small neighborhood in the New York City borough of Queens. Jamaica offers a vibrant tinge of authenticity. Being one of the most ethnically diverse counties of Queens, New York, Jamaica was the longtime home of a solitary World War I veteran named George Clarence Seitz. 81-year-old Seitz, who went by Clarence, was a dedicated soldier who fought for his country in his youth during World War I. Once retired, he preferred to keep his life private and lived alone in a nice home. Though it seemed from the outside that the war veteran lived his life on his own terms, Seitz's life was not free from complications. Just like thousands of others, the vulgar brutality of war had a lasting impact on him. Seitz developed severe PTSD and paranoia due to his time serving in the military. He was extremely reclusive and did not trust anybody. He would regularly dress up in business attire as if he were heading out for an office. Instead, he'd just roam around the neighborhood. The situation was so bad that Seitz did not even trust banks and routinely kept wads of cash on him whenever he set foot outside his house. He'd pull out a large roll of cash when it came time to pay for something. Despite this, his mental faculties were intact. The elderly Seitz never overlooked his daily chores. He was a man of discipline. His clothes were always clean and crisp, his house always clean, his hair always cut, and he presented an all-around neat appearance. No one could ever have imagined that he'd simply disappear one day while performing such a mundane task. Around 10 a.m. on December 10th, 1976, Seitz headed out to a nearby barbershop for a haircut, which was just 2.5 blocks away from his home located at 116th Street in Jamaica. That day, he did not return home, nor the next day, or the day after that. He was never heard from again. It was not until 5 days had passed after Seitz's mysterious disappearance that his family reported him missing. Though authorities began their search immediately, there was not much to go on. He left absolutely no clues behind. Not a trace. Investigators could only speculate as to what could have happened to him. Deputies conducted several interviews in an attempt to glean some information, but the leads were too thin to follow up on. Authorities at the time didn't even know if he even made it to the barbershop or not. The case quickly turned cold. Over the years, the Queens County Sheriff's Office collaborated with the NYPD and FBI, making numerous efforts to solve it, but they could never unravel the mystery. After lying dormant for decades, finally there was an unexpected breakthrough which turned the case white hot. In March of 2019, a woman in her 50s called the 102nd Precinct Detective Squad to report a crime that occurred decades ago. She was an eyewitness to a horrific murder and carried the secret with her for more than 4 decades. The call was picked up by Queens South Homicide Detective Eric Contreras. At the time, he was just 31 years old. He'd been a cop for 9 years and a detective for 3. He was a young and dedicated detective. He was juggling multiple cases at the time, as most detectives do. Contreras was born 12 years after Seitz went missing, but he took a lot of interest in the case from the beginning. The details the woman provided sent chills down the spines of the detectives. She claimed that when she was just 11 years old, she witnessed her mother's boyfriend cutting up a body and burying the body parts in the backyard of a Queens home where she was living back in December of 1976. Although she could not identify the victim, she vividly remembered the details and gave the detectives an exact location. When asked why she stayed silent all those years, she said she was afraid of reprisals, but in the end came forward because she could no longer live with the burden. The mother's boyfriend was identified as Martin Mata, a longtime resident of Jamaica. Interestingly, Martin Mata owned a barbershop called Haircutter along with his brother, which was located on 161st Street in Jamaica. The barbershop was only in operation from the late 1970s to the 1980s. It had been the last known destination of George Seitz, who was a regular customer there. Mata was only 29 years old in 1976 when Seitz went missing. The barbershop was shut down shortly after the incident. However, detectives did not immediately connect the murder to Seitz, who went missing during the same time frame that the woman had estimated. Despite the unbelievable story, the woman's account was so detailed that they decided to begin a thorough search of the property. On March 12, 2019, the investigators raided a house at 8772 115th Street, Richmond Hill, Queens, that belonged to Martin Mata, only 2.5 miles away from the now closed barbershop. Based on the description of the witness, police focused their search for remains in the backyard guarded with a wooden fence. Cadaver dogs first scoured the backyard, and after they confirmed a location, forensic anthropologists from the Emergency Services Unit began excavating. It didn't take long for the searchers to discover partial human remains in a makeshift grave buried underneath concrete that had been poured on top of it, the exact spot where the witness had stated it would be. Unfortunately, only a pelvis and part of the torso were recovered from the scene, as the rest of the body had been dismembered at the neck, shoulders, and hips. NYPD investigators turned to genetic DNA technology to identify the victim, but there seemed to be a problem with the scenario. At the time, New York state law only allowed police to use that method when seeking to identify a suspect, not a victim. The FBI agreed to assist in the investigation since they had no such limitation under federal statute. The Queens County District Attorney's Office, along with the NYPD and the NYC FBI office, contacted Othram, an independent laboratory with expertise in genetic genealogy and DNA sequencing to identify people. The lab was asked to perform advanced DNA testing that would lead to the identity of the homicide victim. Despite the level of decomposition of the remains, Othram was able to extract DNA from the bones and develop a complete DNA profile. Unfortunately, the profile did not match anyone in the local, state, or national databases. To unfold the mystery of the victim's identity, the DNA profile was used to perform a comprehensive genealogical search and to create a family tree through genetic matches. Luckily, the result came up suggesting that the victim's family members were still living in Ohio and California. The Queens South Homicide Squad detectives Contreras and Gain immediately flew out to Ohio to speak with them. The family immediately knew that this had to do with their missing relative. They went on to tell the detectives how George Seitz had vanished after setting off to get a haircut. The question of what had happened to him had stayed with their family ever since. The body was positively identified as George Clarence Seitz from the DNA provided by his family. They also provided a picture of him as a young soldier in uniform. Upon further investigation using NYPD archives and microfiche, detectives were able to find a missing person report for George Seitz from 1976. To tighten the loose ends, an age-progressed photo was created from the picture Seitz's family provided. The witness confirmed it to be the person she saw being dismembered by Martin Motta. Finally, after over 40 years, the family had some answers. The only question that remained was the motive. It was theorized that Motta fatally stabbed Seitz in the head soon after he reached the barbershop and robbed him of $7,000 to $8,000, as he knew about his customers' habits of keeping a large sum of cash with him. People would see the money he had on him, Detective Contreras later said. The extensive investigation lasted for 2 years and spanned over 5 states since the witness first came forward. In November 2021, 75-year-old Martin Motta was arrested from a Jamaica home, where the homeowner says Motta would stay sometimes as a favor to a friend of a friend. He was brought into the Queens County District Attorney's office and arraigned on a charge of intentional murder and remanded. However, no other charges can be brought due to the expiry of the statute of limitations. In October of 2022, Motta pleaded guilty to manslaughter. He was sentenced on November 7, 2022, for 20 years in prison for the 1976 slaying. After 46 years of eluding justice, Martin Motta is being held accountable for his merciless deeds. Though it does not erase the agony Seitz's family was put through, we can only hope that the identification of the remains and the indictment of his killer will bring some peace to his loved ones. For almost 2 decades, Keith Hall hid a big secret from the world. He was a well-known pimp and a drug addict, but there was an even darker side to him that no one knew about. In 2002, Keith murdered 19-year-old Rachel Wilson, whom he had been in a toxic relationship with. A series of lies to the authorities helped him to successfully cover his tracks. But when Rachel's bones turned up several years later, it was game over for him. This story will take us to Middlesbrough, England. This town was once a farm that was home to less than 30 people. With time, the area became industrialized and more populated. Now it's famous for its football club and transporter bridge. Unfortunately, sex trafficking has also been a major problem plaguing Middlesbrough. Teenage girls as young as 16 can be found working as prostitutes. Rachel Wilson is described by her family as full of life, fun, and cheeky. It seemed as if she had her whole life ahead of her, and nothing could possibly go wrong. The Rachel we remember was very happy and bubbly. She was amazing. Nicola Wilson, Rachel's younger sister, told the media, "We went everywhere together and were really close." However, meeting Keith Hall at the age of 16 would mark a turning point in her life. Keith was more than 20 years older than her. Yet, despite this, an unlikely relationship developed between the two. It was obvious from the beginning that their relationship was heading for disaster, but Rachel didn't know any better. Keith was able to take advantage of her innocence, and in no time, he introduced her to a world of hard drugs, specifically cocaine. Rachel soon became heavily dependent on the stimulant. She went from being the greatest sister ever to someone ruled by her addiction. Carl, Rachel's younger brother, said, "She always promised me she would come off the drugs, though. She promised she would be off them by my 18th birthday." Rachel's life began to gradually spin out of control due to the level of influence Keith was having on her. At some point, he decided to kick things up a notch. They needed money to fund their lifestyle, and Keith saw prostitution as the perfect opportunity to bring in that money. He soon talked Rachel into selling her body for money, and because of her addiction, Rachel had no choice but to oblige. She was soon working most nights on the streets of Middlesbrough to fuel both her and Keith's drug habit. Yet, despite her sacrifice, Keith still wasn't satisfied. At times, she brought in less money than he expected. Whenever this occurred, he'd become violent. Rachel was suffering both physical and emotional abuse at the hands of the man she'd chosen to trust. She was growing increasingly more afraid of him as his violent, erratic behavior continued to escalate. Rachel's family did not fail to notice the change in her. They became aware of her drug addiction and saw how it was affecting her. Physically, she was getting thinner and looking like a ghost of her former self. However, they had no idea what she was going through at the hands of Keith. She went to great lengths to hide the abuse. She was always happy, even though we knew she was struggling. Rachel was a loving daughter and an all-around cheeky teenager. Rachel's mother, Tina Wilson, said. Her family eventually sought medical help to combat her addictions. However, their intervention was a little too late. On May 30th, 2002, Rachel paid a visit to her sister, Nicola. That visit was not unusual in any way. At the time, Nicola had just given birth to a baby girl, and Rachel had been going daily to spend quality time with her sister and the new baby. The visit was just like any other. After some time well spent with her sister and niece, they said their goodbyes. That same evening, she also spent time with her mother and other family members. They all went to a fair, and by 11 p.m., Rachel went on her way. That was the last time any of her family members saw her alive. A few days later, Rachel's family were getting increasingly concerned that they hadn't heard from her. This was unlike Rachel, who, despite her lifestyle, was very close with her family. They went in search of Rachel at her apartment and other places she was known to frequent. Yet there was no sign of her. It was as if she had left town entirely. Rachel had her own flat, but she always kept in touch. Sometimes we'd wonder where she was, but she'd always turn up a couple of hours later, Nicola had later said about her sister's disappearance. Eventually, her family involved the police, and a full-scale search for the missing teenager was soon launched. Police questioned Keith and was asked about his whereabouts around the time Rachel disappeared. Keith told authorities that Rachel had run off with a man she'd met at a local fair. He maintained he had no idea what became of her after that. Unfortunately, investigators had no tangible evidence to go on. The only lead the police had was CCTV footage of Rachel. She was last seen on CCTV walking down Southfield Road, Middlesbrough. This was around 7:02 a.m. on May 31st, 2002. In the days that followed, the search for Rachel intensified, but there was still no trace of her. The search continued for 16 months, and in that period, police and Rachel's mother made several appeals to the public for information regarding Rachel's disappearance. They feared the worst, but there was really nothing to confirm that she was dead. Her entire family was thrown into a state of confusion. They had no idea what had become of their beloved Rachel. Her mother, in particular, held out hope that her daughter was out there and would make her way back home and walk through the door at any minute. Rachel, if you see this, you know you can get in touch anytime, day or night, Tina Wilson had said in one of her appeals a few years after her daughter's sudden disappearance. In 2005, Rachel's brother, Benji Hopkins, died from an antidepressant overdose. According to the family, Benji's death had much to do with Rachel's disappearance. He and Rachel had been very close, and her sudden disappearance had taken a huge toll on his death. Benji's death was a huge blow to the family, who was left to deal with another loss. On June 27, 2012, a group of men were working on a farm located on the outskirts of Middlesbrough when they unearthed human bones. The bones were found buried in a shallow grave. Police were contacted, and they immediately set out trying to uncover the identity of the body. Rachel's family was also made aware of the development, since there was a likely chance that the remains were Rachel's. After 2 weeks, the results of the analysis carried out on the bones had come back. A police spokeswoman revealed the findings, saying, "Police have now identified the body found on farmland on the outskirts of Middlesbrough a few weeks ago, and can confirm that it's that of Rachel Wilson, who went missing just over 10 years ago." Rachel's family was broken by the news. "It was a really painful couple of weeks, but I just knew it was her. Even though we had to wait, I knew it was her," Nicholas said at the time our family found out that Rachel was dead and gone forever. Her brother Carl was quoted as saying, "When we were told, we were devastated. It was heartbreaking to think that she had been just a bus journey away from us that whole time." Rachel's mother, of course, was beyond devastated, but she was also somewhat relieved that her daughter had finally been found. "At last she's coming home. That's all I ever wanted. Obviously, I wanted the circumstances to be different, and for her to be coming home alive," her mother Tina said. Preparation for Rachel's funeral was set into motion. The bereaved family received huge support from the community, and a fundraiser was even held to generate money for the funeral. Rachel was finally buried alongside her brother Benji a few months after her remains were found. Yet there were still so many questions that continued preying on the minds of investigators, as well as Rachel's family. How had Rachel met her end, and who had been her killer? The examination of Rachel's remains had not revealed anything that could have led to her death. The only thing the investigators knew was that there was no clothing where her bones had been discovered, and this meant that she had been buried naked. Temporary Detective Superintendent Paula Jewell, who had investigated Rachel's death, explained, "We couldn't establish a cause of death because the remains were just skeletal, and there was no forensic evidence left at the scene." She added, "Whilst it was a significant development to find someone who had been missing for 10 years, it didn't give us the lines of inquiry we thought we'd get." Investigators began working around the clock to uncover what had happened to Rachel, but before they could make significant progress, Rachel's father, Bernard Wilson, tragically died. This was another tragic shock for the family. All Bernard wanted was to know what had happened to his daughter, and it's devastating that he went to his grave not knowing, Tina had said about Bernard's death. In 2014, police finally made a breakthrough in the case. A suspect was named, and it was none other than Keith Hall. Keith, who was 54 at the time, was arrested and questioned regarding Rachel's death. A search of his property was also conducted, and police discovered some incriminating items. Part of what was found was a lock of Rachel's hair and a handwritten note from her. The note, which was addressed to Keith, was believed to have been written just a few hours before her disappearance. In the note, she had apologized to Keith for not making enough money. The note, together with a lock of hair, would later serve as a major piece of evidence against Keith. He was later released on bail, since there was no concrete evidence to prove that he had a hand in Rachel's death. However, he remained a prime suspect in the case. Over the next couple of years, Keith became a regular visitor to the police station. Yet, each time he was asked about Rachel's death, he kept leading investigators in circles. In 2018, a special grant was provided for the investigation unit of the police department. This was done so that more efforts could be channeled towards solving Rachel's murder. In the months that followed, investigators paid visits to several sex workers who had been around at the time of Rachel's disappearance. The number of these sex workers totaled about 500. It was time-consuming work, but gradually, progress was being made. A lot of witnesses we spoke to were in the sex industry and didn't want to go back and relive some of the worst periods of their life, so it was very difficult. But thankfully, some very brave people came forward and told their story. Detective Duell recalled. Many of these witnesses pointed out the toxic relationship that had existed between Keith and Rachel. They revealed how Keith had led her into prostitution and how he was in the habit of hitting her whenever she brought in less money than expected. These acts of violence were said to sometimes leave her covered in bruises. Another witness also came forward and revealed to the police some incriminating things Keith had said right after Rachel's bones were found. According to the witness, Keith had told him that he had killed Rachel. With all of these revelations, it became more obvious to the police that Keith was the man they were looking for. Their suspicion was confirmed. They knew from the start that there was something fishy about Keith, but lacked strong evidence to charge him with anything. Finally, the walls were closing in on him, and a strong case was being built up. In addition to the accounts of the witnesses, investigators also sat through several hours of CCTV footage that was recorded around the time of Rachel's disappearance. From the footage, detectives noticed a purple Vauxhall combo van moving around the Middlesbrough area. This van was believed to have been used in Rachel's murder. Upon further investigation, they were able to link the vehicle to Keith. With all this evidence, investigators were able to come up with a rough idea of how Rachel had met her end. They believed that after Rachel left her family on the day she was last seen, she'd worked throughout the night, as usual. At some point, she met up with Keith, who had been disappointed by her earnings for that day. When Keith confronted her, he resorted to his usual physical abuse. Investigators surmised that this time around, he went too far and ended up beating her to death. When he realized what he'd done, he decided that it was best to cover up his tracks. Authorities believed he waited a few days and, after the murder, loaded her lifeless body into his van and drove off to the farm where her bones were found 10 years later. This was what authorities believed anyway. It's not clear if things happened exactly that way, since Keith never gave an account of how or why he killed Rachel. In December 2019, Keith was charged with the murder of Rachel Wilson. In addition to this, he was also charged with living off of immoral earnings and perverting the course of justice, the latter due to him trying to influence a key witness to lie to the police. Despite all of the evidence that pointed to him as Rachel's killer, Keith maintained his innocence and pleaded not guilty. After this, a trial date was set for June 3, 2020, but due to the coronavirus pandemic, it was shifted to October 6 that same year. The trial date was once again changed until May 11, 2021 was finally agreed upon. On the day his trial was due to start, Keith finally confessed that he was responsible for Rachel's death. He denied the charge of murder, but pleaded guilty to manslaughter, which was a lesser charge. He also pleaded guilty to the other two charges brought against him. After his admission of guilt, a spokesperson for the Crown Prosecution Service, which is responsible for prosecuting criminal cases, spoke to the media about the reasons why Keith's plea for manslaughter was accepted. He revealed that the case had been an extremely challenging one, and because Rachel's remains were discovered after more than a decade, it was impossible to identify the cause of death or the motive behind it. A murder charge would have required that the intent be proven. As a result of Keith's Hall acceptance that he was responsible for Rachel's death, alongside other evidential factors, the case was again reviewed and a decision taken that a plea to manslaughter was acceptable, the spokesperson said. He added, "A guilty plea to manslaughter means that Keith Hall has been convicted of killing Rachel and disposing of her body, and our decision was carefully taken following consultation with both the police and Rachel's family." On November 1st, 2021, Keith was sentenced to 18.5 years in jail for manslaughter, living off the proceeds of prostitution, and perverting the course of justice. This was a relief to Rachel's family, who'd waited for 19 long years to get justice for her. It's difficult to feel any sense of happiness with this result, when at the heart of this inquiry is a 19-year-old vulnerable girl who lost her life in extremely tragic circumstances. Detective Duell